You've got your metal work done. You've got all the body work done. You've painted your car and it is sitting in your garage beautifully painted, but you are now to the point that matters the most. What grit do you start cutting and buffing? And is it worth the risk of doing if you have to repaint the entire car? In today's video, we want to dive into testing exactly how much product do you have on the car so you don't make the mistake that I see too often. If you guys would do me a solid, we are trying to give back to the younger generation of craftsmen trying to learn this trade. And the more that you guys can please like and subscribe to the channel, the more we can get out there and promote what we do. We have classes. Please check out sylvesterscustoms.com for the dates. When you're tackling your project, why is it important that you understand how much product do you have on the car? And I mean, that could be primer, that could be clear coat, but why does it matter? The biggest reason is if time is money or materials is taking out of your project at home in your DIY garage, then it starts directly affecting us, right? The issue that we had here in the shop is that we had cleared a car, and when we were in the process of cutting and buffing, we burned through. And the reason that it struck it funny is because we have not had a burn through in quite a while. And then I thought back, why did we burn through? Consistency is the key factor in everything that we do in restoration, especially at a high level. And the one thing that I changed was I changed guns from a 1.4 tip with an LS 400 to a LPH 400 with a 1.3 tip. And if you're asking yourself, well, is a 1.3 that different than a 1.4? I actually don't know the answer to that. So I started brainstorming and coming up with different ideas of how we can actually test that. And they sell a mill gauge, and this mill gauge we bought on Amazon. It hooks up to your phone and it will tell you exactly how many mils you have on the panel. But what you need to know about this mill gauge is that it is reading to bare metal. So if you are testing this after the fact and your car has primers and fillers, it's irrelevant. It's testing everything in the mills. If we're wanting to test one thing, you can do this demonstration on primers. You can do this demonstration for clear like we're going to show you today. But the reason that we're going to show you is so that way you guys have a very good understanding of how much product do I actually put down. And when I say how much product do you put down, it's going to be different person to person, gun to gun. The products you're going to use is going to change all of that. Let's talk about the guns themselves. The guns themselves have variation of settings, right? You have air pressure. Well, why does air pressure matter? Air pressure, the higher that you go, the smaller the droplet. Some guys confuse that for a dry coat, and they confuse it with how far you are being a dry coat and it's not wet. But if you actually turn your air pressure down, you get a bigger droplet that is a wetter droplet, and it goes down a lot heavier onto the panel. Our needle setting is going to be how much product is actually coming out of the gun as you pull back on the trigger. You need to be setting these up every time that you paint so you understand how much you paint every time. You can't go paint, well, you can because I did it for a lot of years that way, but you can go paint and not ever set up your gun. But you're never going to know why maybe that paint job came out really glassy and perfect and why the other one has runs all over it. Be consistent in every single thing that you do. Don't be overwhelmed with the painting part, because really after you get done doing all the body work and priming and all that stuff, you should have the confidence to paint your car if you're starting to practice how you paint. Setting your gun up and testing your coats. You want it to, when you do a 50% overlap and you move down, it to just wet out. You want the car to look like one perfect droplet. And then when it comes to the fan, this adjustment is going to be a bigger fan or a narrower path. Maybe you're trying to get into a small area in a roll cage. Just depends. But today's demonstration, we're going to be setting up the LPH 400 with a 1.3 and the LS 400 with a 1.4 with the exact same settings. I want to compare how many more mils do I actually get with my standard 1.4 that I'm used to using with the same painter, same techniques, and the same product. So we're going to be using the VC5700 Show Clear from the PPG Vibrance line. When we do this test, I want to be comparing that onto the bare sheet metal, so that way I get a very accurate representation of how many mils are actually on that panel with one coat. The second panel that we're going to be doing is going to be the same clear, same gun, but we're going to do 4 coats. That way I can cross-reference. Is the measurement that I'm getting on one coat, can I multiply it 4 times and get an accurate reading for 4 coats? How much of a variance will there be? That's what we want to test between the 2 panels. The third panel, I'm going to be using the same clear, but I'm going to be using the 1.3 tip. So that way I can do a apples to apples of 1 coat with a 1.4 and 1 coat with a 1.3. The fourth panel that we're going to be using is actually going to be showing the Ace of Shades. I just thought, what the heck, we have it on the shelf, why not use it? We haven't even tried this clear before. They're both a 2-to-1 clear. I like a high solid clear because we want a good amount of mils, so that way we can cut a car with 600 grit and work it up to 3000 and still have enough protective coating of the clear on the vehicle. So I thought, if we spray 1 coat of the Ace of Shades 2-to-1, the only difference there that you I don't want to say the only difference, one of the main differences that you have there when you actually feel the product and the viscosity in the can is that the Ace of Shades seems a little bit thinner than what I'm used to with the VC5700. There's a drastic difference in the price, and I'm sure that, well, we don't know what we're sure of. We're going to test it and we're going to show you guys actually what's left on the panel when it dries. Check. All right, we are back from the weekend. We let all 4 of these panels dry and we came back, we used the mil gauge, and what's cool about that mil gauge is when you're looking at the app on your phone, it gives you can do a variation of tests. So say you're doing the test on a car and maybe you do it over a whole fender and you evenly space them, it will give you an average based on how many tests that you actually took. We did 5 tests per panel, and what we actually got was pretty surprising because we used what I use all the time, which is VC5700. It's a PPG Vibrance Clear. And we had some Ace of Shades clear that was really just sitting on the shelf meaning to test, and we just never got around to it. But for 1 coat, and that is with a 1.4 tip, this is out of the Iwata LS400, the Supernova. That's the one that I use the majority of the time. And for 1 coat, we got 0.58 mils. And comparing it from a 1.4 tip to a 1.3 tip, we got 0.45 mils. So it's kind of cool to see that you do get a difference in mils, at least for an average of 5 tests, 0.58 with a 1.4 and 0.45 with a 1.3 tip. Now I just wanted to see if we're doing apples to apples on 1.4 tip and then we do 1 coat versus 4 coats, does the math actually add up? It's pretty close. So the way that I sprayed these panels, 0.58 being 1 coat, 4 coats being 1.93 is the average. It's pretty close. The other thing is these are small panels. They're probably not getting exactly the same amount of flash time, but that's pretty accurate. Now here's the one that really threw me for a loop because I was not expecting Ace of Shades. And by all means, this is not a plug. This is not a paid thing from Ace of Shades. But we got 0.76 mils out of a 1.4 tip versus 0.58. And a lot of you guys may think, well, that's not that big of a difference. Here's the difference. So I called the paint shop and found out what that stuff actually costs. If you were to buy a gallon of PPG Clear and you didn't have a discount, you're looking at $930 for a gallon, and that's with the hardeners. Here's the other thing. That's $930 without reducer. The cool part is Ace of Shades does not require a reducer, but you can buy a gallon of Ace of Shades for $317. So that being a third of the price, and the fact that it has as much, if not a little bit more mils, I think it's definitely going to be in our mix-up of tests where we start putting the stuff out in the sun and see how it actually reacts with wear down and UV protectants. Now here's the very interesting thing about UV protectants. Everybody's always, does it have the best UV protectants? But what you do need to know is that as your clear coat is drying, the UV protectants actually raises to the top. Now, what do we do after a clear coat is completely dried and cured? We sit there and we cut and buff it. And when we cut and buff it, you actually end up taking a lot of the UV protectants out of the clear. So when it comes to a chemist, I'm not a chemist, but I've had chemists come here and we've talked to them. It is an interesting fact that a majority of people are cutting and polishing these cars, and really what you're left with is not a lot of UV. Why do clear coats fail? Clear coats typically fail either from bad prep. Maybe you were outside of the flash time between base coat and clear coat, meaning that clear was open beyond its limitations of what the TDS sheet says. TDS sheet is a technical data sheet. That is just telling you specifics per that product. What temperature that it's tested at, what viscosity it likes, what flash times are. If that's 10 minutes, 15 minutes, some speed clears and stuff like that require less time. It gives you all of the things, the gun setup, what size tip that it likes, and that goes for primers, clears. You can do this exact same test for all of those different products. So it's either a issue with the prep being, maybe you were outside of a window, or it's too thin of clear. A lot of times is the case. And if you don't have enough clear on the car and it becomes thin, it's going to start breaking down with the sun beating on it. That's why you see a lot of the roofs, hoods, trunks that start delaminating first, because that's where it's being hit the most. But how do you test that? A mil gauge. This is a perfect test. One, to see how much clear you actually put on the car. And then what we want to do is we want to take it a step further just for peace of mind. We want to do our typical color sanding process on one of these panels, just to give you guys an idea how much mils do you actually take off. Majority of you guys that are doing collision work are going to be starting with 1000 grit, 1500 grit. We're actually starting with 600 grit in a majority of the restoration and high-end cars. We're cutting it down flat. And the reason that we do that is because if you're using 1000 grit or 1500 grit, it's riding over the, call it the urethane wave, is what's most technically talked about. That clear, as it starts to shrink, starts to look like orange peel, and you get dieback. That's also what dieback is. As it shrinks, we want to cut that out dead flat, so that way our long lights and our reflections appear to be nice and clear and crisp, and that's why we go back to 6. But a lot of guys are very hesitant to do that because they're afraid they're going to burn through everywhere. Here's a perfect example. You can get the amount of mils that you need with any gun, any clear, as long as you are testing it and you know what you're putting on and know what you're taking off. So we're going to be using Jason Killmer's little sanding blocks. If you guys don't check him out on Instagram, shoot him a message. He's a good buddy of mine. He hand makes all these. It's basically an acrylic flat block on one side, and on the other side he has a different variation of foam density that for the other side. The reason that that works good is because when you're trying to cut something dead flat, you want to use the acrylic side on the 600. I like to use 600 grit, 1000 grit. We have adopted a lot of Jason's processes because he's one of the guys, man. That's who we like to look up to, is who's doing the best work, and just put that in your process. You don't have to recreate the wheel. Just do what everybody else is doing and do it to the best of your ability. We're going to cut it with 600. So I'm going to take a mil reading on this corner before we do it, just so I have an idea. And I'm going to put some reference marks above and below so we can actually get a reading beforehand of that exact spot. And then we're going to sand it dead flat. We're going to dry it off. and do a mill reading in between each one of the grits, just so we know what are we actually left with of clear. Do we need to pivot and put more coats, or do we need to be using a 1.4 tip, a 1.3? Turn our air pressure up, turn our air pressure down. All of those things are going to affect our mill thickness. If you guys haven't already subscribed, I would keep an eye out. We are going to be doing a video talking specifically about how does your spray gun operate, how does air pressures affect it, how does gun settings affect it, and really dial you guys in so that way you know how you're going to tackle your project at home. And if you're watching this video late, we are going to link that video in this description. And also, this is not the only way. If you guys have any comments that you want to add to this and make this video better, I know I get a lot of things out of watching tutorials and coming back and reading the comments so I can get something more out of different people's experiences. I'm not the only guy, this is just our way. So please drop a comment and let us know what you guys use on the daily. We've put the crosshatch on the panel. That way, every time we put that mill gauge, we're pretty close to our X and Y on where we're actually located. Now, we did a reading of the clear in that exact spot before we sanded anything. And we did this on a panel that only had one coat. And the reason that we did that was because we want to give the representation of how many coats are you putting on your car? How many mills do you have, right? Most collision guys have very little clear. They might put a coat and a coat and a half, and usually those are like a 4-to-1 clear. A 4-to-1 clear is a lot thinner, and it doesn't have the build like some of the European clears and some of the 2-to-1s. On this one, we know we have almost a mil. And with almost having a mil, we went through the process of doing 600 grit and seeing how much we take off. Now, here's the disclaimer. Every pass that you go over that area with that 600 grit, or any other grit for that matter, every pass is going to take more and more mils. So pressure is going to change how many mils you're taking, and how many passes. Everybody's going to be different. And even though you're doing the entire car, you're just trying to get yourself a baseline of what do I typically take off and how much do I always have left. If you know, you take off a mil. So in this case, we actually burned through the panel because we started in 600 grit. We tried to treat something that would be like a collision clear with a restoration process, and that's why we don't advise people to go to 600 if you're doing this on a newer OEM car. They don't have the mils. If we're talking about having 2 or 3 mils just in clear, the majority of cars have like 3 to 4 mils, and that's with all of the material. That's with your primers, your base coats, and your clears. So you do not have the material to be able to sand that flat. Majority of these cars have a lot of orange peel, but we did burn through with only having one coat. Now, we didn't even get to 3,000 grit. We went 600, 1,000 grit, 2,000 grit, and we burned. So at that point, we went through about a mil in just our sanding process. So right out of the gate, we know that. Now, I want to give you guys the comparison of, we went all the way to 3,000 grit. So we did this on the only panel that we put 4 coats on. In this panel, in that exact spot, we started with 2.36 mils. And when we went through 600 grit, we took 0.16, 1,000 grit, we took 0.2 mils, 2,000 grit, 0.2 mils. We were at least consistent there. And then when we went to 3,000 grit, it only took 0.08 mils. What we actually took for our process on this particular panel was a 0.64 mils. Could vary a bit because, again, pressure. Did you start your car and you were good that day and you weren't tired? And then by the end of the day, you probably didn't sand it as much. So you're just looking for a variance, a baseline, so you kind of know what you have, right? If we know we're only taking a little over half a mil to a mil, if I know I have 2.5 mils over the majority of the car and we're doing an average test across the panel, we can feel pretty comfortable about doing this process. That is what we're trying to give you guys. The confidence in actually going into it and not being scared of what you have. Now, what I would like you guys to do, because we have not done this test, if you guys have done mill gauge tests, how much do you actually take with a wool pad, a foam pad? How much material comes off? If you guys have experience with that, please put a comment in the section below. One last thing I want to cover, and that is the topic of flow coating. What flow coating is on one day you cleared your car with however many coats. Let's call it 3 coats. And then you came in with 600 grit and you knocked that all down. Well, now you have an idea of how many mils you actually took off in 600 grit. So at that point, you remask the car, you re-clear the entire car with another 3 coats. Keep in mind, a lot of people think that they now have 6 coats of clear to sand, and you do not. And the reason that is because if you have an area that you have wet sanded and then cleared again, if you only have, let's call it 1.5 mils in those 3 coats, if you go through that 1.5 mils to the second or the first round of clear that you have on the car, you are going to have a halo, and it does not just blend between the 2 coats. They do not do that. They act as 2 separate paint jobs, and you will see a halo where the burn is. I hope this gave you guys different aspects to think about in your processes, and I hope you guys share this video with somebody so that way maybe they don't burn their car. We'll see you guys next time. I hope.
You're fine too.
Want to redo it?
No.